the other attendees and participants into the room, and then we'll get started.
Sounds good.
Thanks, everyone. Looks like we have a good group for today's conversation. Thanks, everyone, for joining in from all the many places you are, and we're excited to spend some time with Priti, who is joining us from the West Coast.
That's right, from Oakland, California.
Great. Let's give it a couple more seconds, and then we can just start diving in. It's like we have a good group. All right, well, let's get started as everyone settles in. Welcome again, everybody, to today's conversation, which is an inside look at how change happens and the role that you can play. So good afternoon, and welcome again, Priti. We're 9 months into this pandemic right now, and as of yesterday, there are 6.7 million confirmed cases of COVID in America. This pandemic continues to put into sharp focus the limits of an already ineffective healthcare system in the States. My name is Manmeet Mehta, and I work with the Ashoka team. And today, we're privileged to be joined by Ashoka fellow Priti Krishtel. We're going to talk to her to learn a little bit more about this moment we're in, what is working, what she's hopeful for in the future. A little more about Priti. So in the early 2000s, Priti was a young lawyer working with low-income communities in India. And she noticed that many of her clients couldn't afford life-saving medicine. And then she had an epiphany about what was the root cause underlying this issue, and she co-founded IMAC. In the 2 decades since, Priti has worked tirelessly in nearly 50 countries towards building healthcare systems that create equitable access to life-saving medicine. So once again, Priti, appreciate all the time that you're taking out to join us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Priti, tell us, what can we expect when a vaccine is successfully developed and brought to market?
So right now there are 35 vaccine candidates that are being evaluated in clinical trials, which is kind of astonishing if you think about it, in a matter of months that this is where we are. The reality is that a vaccine is not going to be a silver bullet. You know, we've talked about this, Manmeet. You know, some people are going to get it first, and some people aren't going to get it at all. And we've seen that play out with PPE, with ventilators, with testing. You know, when professional basketball players were getting tests first and the rest of us weren't, that's just how it works. And for those of us who work in global public health, we've seen this play out over and over and over again with HIV, with hepatitis C. And so I think it's really important to shift the narrative right now from vaccines being this quick fix. We all want the world to go back to normal, but there's a different way to look at this, which I think is not to perceive the vaccine as a one-stop solution for COVID so everything can get back to normal, but instead, how can we think about the systems that historically haven't been working for medicines? And how can we use this as an opportunity to rebuild and reimagine some of these systems? Because after this, you know, after COVID, the next pandemic is right around the corner. And if we get this right, we are not only going to be fixing the situation for COVID, we're going to be fixing it for generations to come.
Yeah, thank you. And when you sort of start to think about the vaccine just for this pandemic, and then the idea of a system that can serve us for our grandchildren's grandchildren, let's say, we're in this moment. We're at the early stage of that new imagination, and in this moment, we find that the U.S. taxpayers have basically funded nearly $11 billion into research on the COVID vaccine for this pandemic. Right. And these funds are meant to incentivize the risky business of developing vaccines. Now, this is, as you say, it's a generation-defining opportunity and a chance to shape precedent. How is this going to influence the pricing for the vaccine? And will the taxpayers be rewarded for effectively being angel investors in the development of this vaccine?
Yeah, It's a great question because, at the heart of it, it's supposed to be a social contract, right? The US government is investing in vaccines because vaccines are traditionally seen to be a really risky investment. There's not a lot of guaranteed return on investment for the investors. And so because there's a market failure there, the government steps in to try to correct for that. The problem is that it's supposed to be a social contract. And what we see is that the government deploys significant cash to make this happen without any public commitments of what access and affordability look like. So that's something the Access to Medicines movement has been heavily focused on. If you look at which companies are getting the money, I think it also gives a good illustration of what's happening. So if you look at Moderna, which is probably the company that's being talked about the most in the press right now, the government invested $2.5 billion in this company that had never brought a vaccine to market. And our colleagues over at civil society organizations, KEI and Public Citizen started investigating and realized that that $2.5 billion was actually 100% of the investment that went into Moderna. Now, why that's important is because there aren't any publicly known conditions for access or affordability. But Moderna, with that $2.5 billion investment, is poised to generate $40 billion in revenue, and a significant part of that is going to be profit, right? And then on top of that, this technology can be leveraged for other diseases, for other things they're working on to generate even more revenue and then profit. And so I think what the movement has been trying to bring to light is that if this is a social contract, we need better negotiation on behalf of taxpayers because there's not a venture capitalist alive who would place a bet like this. I can't hear you, Mandy.
Do you think that the government is negotiating with different pharmaceutical companies, with Moderna, with others?
That's a difficult question for me to answer. I'm sure there have been discussions, but at the end of the day, this is our money. Those discussions should be transparent. We should be privy to what's being discussed and what's being committed to, because at the end of the day, what we've seen in global health time and time again is that the details matter and those commitments matter. Leaving it up to the voluntary actions of the industry is not the right way to curb global pandemics.
Thank you. And just a quick housekeeping note, we're in conversation with Priti Krishtel, who is our Ashoka fellow, and we're trying to understand a little bit better how specifically the COVID vaccine, but the vaccine and healthcare system is working to serve us all. Please continue to put in your comments and questions in the chat, and Priti and I will make sure that we get to them at the end. But let's continue this conversation around understanding how this vaccine will come to be and who will have access to it. What sort of takes my mind towards, the conversation around building back better and imagining a post-pandemic scenario where we are in a healthier place, where we are able to all thrive. And there's a famous quote attributed to a Stanford economist who said, look, let's not let any crisis go to waste. So what is specifically the opportunity that you are seeing in this moment?
I think the opportunity of this moment, our movement, there are so many, the way we work, I should start by saying this, is that we have a combination of technical work that happens, technical solutions to understand the medicines market as a whole, which is combined at key moments with public pressure. And we've seen that. I mean, some of you may remember the late 90s in South Africa, where a mobilized global public really built public pressure to make sure that affordable generics were available and that prices of HIV medicines could come down so global treatment could be scaled. We don't often get those moments where everybody is engaged, where everybody sees themselves as part of this movement. And I think we're on that moment again, where people are thinking about everything from, what's getting prioritized for R&D, what is going on with supply chains? Where are our public research dollars going? How much are people going to pay at the end for this? This is a moment where many people are thinking about these issues. So in that sense, even though it's happening in the face of such hardship and tragedy, it's really an opportunity for us to get as many people engaged in reimagining the medicine system as a whole, to provide for more equitable and just outcomes down the line.
So you're talking about the contours of what a better system could look like, which is an effort of all of us and of many ideas together. You've also talked before, you referred to the potential for more pandemics that we will experience in the coming years, and how this is actually a moment that can help us break the cycle of panic and neglect. And so are there a couple of things that you would prioritize immediately as we respond in all of those threads that you've just outlined for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the core areas that we would emphasize is the idea of open science. After different pandemics, we get really caught up in figuring out what's going to happen. Governments stockpile vaccine, the threat subsides, and then we go back to normal. But that research that's happening could be shared, knowledge could be unlocked. We could be building in consortium between government, drug makers, universities to build on that knowledge. But our system of proprietary knowledge, of locking things up, of competition instead of collaboration, it holds us back from a world that's possible.
That's interesting. It sort of brings to highlight another sense that's sort of feeling unique about this moment. And this is the realization that one individual is safe from this virus only when most, or ideally all, but most of us are safe. And it feels like what we're witnessing is a shift away from deep-rooted individualism that we've experienced in the past few decades, and a resurgence of a sense of mutuality and collective prosperity. So talk to us about that, and also what this means in terms of this idea of vaccine nationalism that's been talked about.
Yeah, wow, that's a really beautiful way of articulating what's happening. And I would say, I think it's very true that at the individual level, at the neighborhood level, at the local level, we are seeing those shifts as, neighbors care for neighbors, people check in on folks, people are thinking beyond themselves to how can I care for community, for state, just beyond our normal circles. But it's not what's happening at the level of government. And that's a true statement across the board, across the world. And it is really disappointing to see that so many of the steps we've taken forward in the last few decades to have global cooperation on global health, to have partnership, to think about our neighbors, about other countries, about global public health as a whole, that's just being eroded right now. So in the context of vaccine nationalism, I would say as an overarching statement, what we're seeing right now is scarcity mindset. And scarcity is a choice. So all of us are being presented a false narrative, in our view, from government, that there's only so much vaccine to go around. And so we are going to have to be very careful with how it's allocated. And I think that scarcity mentality to begin with is because many of our demands as the movement have not been listened to over the last 2 decades. And I'm getting a little fired up now, but I just, we have been saying for the last 20 plus years that we need to be investing in local manufacturing capacity in countries around the world. Countries are ready to take this on. We have been pointing to the need to diversify our supply chains, to make sure that countries who are less able to afford drugs have the ability to sustain and even thrive through a time like this. And instead, where we are is that we haven't invested in that capacity. We have basically had an over-reliance on systems of locking up knowledge, things like the IP system, like patents, like trade secrets, that basically encourage companies not to collaborate. The system is saying, lock up your knowledge, make as much money as possible, even during a pandemic. And the way this is playing out is this. Today, we're not having the choice where countries who are less able to afford the vaccine can figure out what to do on their own. Instead, they are left to the mercy of high-income country governments. So we have option A and option B. And actually, Bill and Melinda Gates put out an op-ed this morning that I think frames that scenario really nicely and is worth reading and looking up. Option A is where we keep going in the direction of global collaboration that we've had for all these years. And we figure out together as high income, middle income, and low income countries, how are we going to allocate resources? Now, these systems also have their problems because they exclude a lot of countries, but the basic tenet is cooperation and mutuality. The other model is where high income countries say, I'm not going to participate in a collaborative system because I'm going to look out for my citizens first. Now, the op-ed this morning by Bill and Melinda Gates explained two reasons why that's false. Number one, it's going to take longer to curb the pandemic, which is just crazy, right? It's becoming politicized that it's going to, at least here in the US, right? Like, we're going to take care of our people first, which is foolish from a public health strategy perspective, and just from a morality perspective, So first, we could be out of this faster if we went with the collaborative approach. And then secondly, what their study found, which I was really, really floored by, is that we could cut the number of COVID deaths in half if we went with a collaborative approach. In half. This means we could save twice as many lives. I will get off my soapbox now, but this is just, I think if I had one thing to say to people who are listening is this: if you are from a high income country right now, we have an obligation to push our governments to act in a way that is globally cooperative and not competitive.
So let's stay on the soapbox for 10 seconds more, because I was just about to ask you, what is the pathway to this collaborative model? Like, what are some of the things that we can start doing to move towards that?
Yeah, so I think there's short-term and long-term. I'm always focused on long-term. Long-term is we have plans that advocates, the WHO, many technical experts have charted out about what does it mean to actually build manufacturing and production capacity across the global south. It is so critical because we're always dealing with, what's the expression you use, Manmeet? The cycle of panic and neglect.
Yes.
So in this moment, everybody suddenly cares. Why is there suddenly an over-reliance on India and China for pharmaceutical products? That's how it's always been. What we need is not only to make sure that those industries stay strong, we need to make sure we have that production capacity built up even more than it already is in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, most importantly, across the African continent. And those investments just aren't made, And in a moment like this, that kind of long-term strategic thinking would benefit everyone. It's incredibly frustrating that those blueprints have not been actually acted upon. So that's the long term. I think in the short term, shifting our governments from the competitive hoarding approach of buying up any possible vaccine for our own countries and shifting to participating in these global mechanisms and holding the global mechanisms accountable to not exclude countries, to make sure every country is included, to make sure there's active civil society participation and representation, particularly from the global south. I think it's critical, and that is the immediate next step that needs to happen. We can't keep going in this direction. There's going to be too much loss of life, and it's going to take too much time to get us out of this mess.
Yeah, and what are some of these global mechanisms, just so we're all aware and learn more about those?
Yeah, the primary one is Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance. They have something called COVAX. So if you look that up, that's, and I believe that the op-ed this morning touches on it. And I'll just say again about COVAX, very important to have a collaborative model Also important to follow the important activists who are pushing even that model to be more inclusive, to not leave countries out, to ensure representation at that global convening level. And so maybe what we'll do after this is we will put out on Twitter some of the activists you should be following to understand what those concerns are.
Great. And we'll continue to share your information in the chat. I know my colleagues are putting all those resources there. Priti, just to shift tacks a minute, as time is really flying. As we talk about vaccines till now, I want to shift a little bit also to talk about medicines and other treatments, which is also a challenge. The price on life-saving drugs in the States has increased at 7 times the rate of inflation since 2012. And what have you uncovered about this?
So you're talking about the best-selling drugs in America. The prices are just going up and up and up. And we've seen this across the world. It's not an American story. Our most recent investigation was American. So this is, I keep talking about the medicine system, right? From drug development to drug access, we have this medicine system. And part of that is patents. And that's where my organization focuses. We focus on that because we believe that it's a root source of power, of shifting capital, and ultimately shifting access. So when we started to look into why drugs were so expensive in the States, what we basically found was that on these 10 best-selling drugs in 2018, the prices were going up. So we call our team the patent detectives. So we started investigating what was going on with patents. And what we found was that on average for these drugs, there were 125 patent applications being filed per drug. So what does that mean? For any invention, you're supposed to get 1 patent, right? So if you invent something, you get a patent from the government.
Got it. Priti, if I feel, let me interrupt you. Would you also share for all of us what a patent is?
For sure. I just realized that and I started backtracking. So when you invent something, you get a patent, and a patent is a right given to you from the government. It is a time-limited monopoly, 20 years. During that time, you are the only one who can be on the market. You are the only one that can make and sell your product. Unless you license it to somebody else, it's yours. And then the idea is that after that 20-year period, other competitors can enter the market, and competition is proven to bring prices down, and consumers have more choice, which frankly is our right at that point.
So going back to the price.
So the price increases. So we found that on these best-selling drugs, there were over 125 patents filed on each. 71 of those patents on average at that time had been granted. So rather than one invention, one patent, suddenly we were seeing patents proliferate on a specific drug product. Now, what I'll say about this is that you're supposed to get that monopoly period for 20 years. But what our research found was that for many of these drugs, or on average, I should say, the monopoly length was almost doubling. It was going from 20 years to 38 years. And what was really interesting is we started looking into what was going on with the prices. So towards the end, right when, I'm assuming lawyers like myself, except who work at law firms, started to worry about what's going to happen when the patents expire, because then we're going to lose our market hold. So they started filing a lot more patents. And towards the end of that time period, you can just see the price curve go like this on these drugs. And so we put out this investigation right before the midterms in America, the midterm elections. And it was very weird because usually nobody listens to us. You say patents at a dinner party and people's eyes glaze over. And these reports went viral. And they turned into the subject matter for congressional hearings and for bills. And so I would say meaningful action hasn't yet been taken, but at least this issue is on the radar of the press and policymakers. And we're hopeful that we can now start to design a system that corrects for this friction in the system and better serves invention and access.
I want to dig a little deeper to that last sentence. You said recently, and I'm quoting here, I think correctly, in addressing the patent system,
Mm,
we are dismantling the root source of power that's currently wired to driving inequity and rewiring it to actually work for the people.
yeah.
So, what does meaningful action on patent reform look like?
I want to say one thing about COVID before I answer your question. Like, I want people to understand why we're doing this. Um, so I was following when Gilead Sciences, the American drug company, started to talk about remdesivir, the COVID treatment. And we've all just been tracking what's happening. A lot of advocacy has happened to make sure the company is, acting equitably. I know folks over there who, there's just a race to say, well, how are we going to develop remdesivir? How are we going to get it to people? And so what I thought was so interesting in watching remdesivir, and I'm not sure if people know this, is that when you saw things like Gilead set its price,
Mm-hmm.
stock market was cool, okay? And then you saw Gilead make an announcement about how it was going to partner with generic manufacturers in low and middle income countries. And guess what the response was from the street? This is in the middle of a global pandemic. People think that there are special rules for the market during pandemics. It's not true. This is a systemic problem. We do not incentivize the outcomes we want to see from our drug companies. And so when you see action that a company takes in the middle of a pandemic to actually increase access globally to a drug, and you see the market respond by just going down $6 billion, we have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so our platform is born out of that reality. It is how are we going, and the patent system is just one part of the larger market. There's work to do, in different places.
Mm-hmm.
But on the patent system, which is where we've worked for a very long time, we have a set of 5 prescriptions. The first is that we need to raise the bar for what gets a patent. It is just crazy. Like our latest report on this cancer drug, Imbruvica, showed that AbbVie, the drug maker, the House Oversight Committee in the US just subpoenaed them because of their egregious pricing and patenting practices. They filed 188 patent applications on this cancer drug. 166, 88 have been granted. So instead of 20 years, they're getting 29. And what does that mean for taxpayers is that we are spending, as Americans, $41 billion for that extra 9 years where we don't have competition. So raising the bar is at the heart of our platform. The rest of the acronym, so it's called RAISE, that's raise the bar. Second is amending incentives. And we're looking at all the stakeholders involved with medicines production and patenting to say, how can we shift their incentives to align with the outcomes we want to see? I is for increased participation. Right now, in the US, there is not enough public participation. It's a black box. Only corporate interests have a seat at the table. So an equitable system would have more transparency, more accountability baked into the system. S stands for standing for justice. So expanding the ability for the public to legally participate in patent cases, especially in court. Mm-hmm. And then E stands for expand oversight. So in America, there's literally no oversight of the patent system. And so we're calling on the Inspector General, we are calling on the executive branch, we're calling on Congress to really heighten scrutiny on the system with the intention of figuring out there are these massive inefficiencies and frictions in the system. How are we going to correct for those now to lower drug prices to make sure everybody can access medicine?
Oh, well, that's an ambitious aspiration, and we're so grateful that you and so many of your colleagues are working on this vision. I want to sort of understand a little bit more. Your comment about the House Oversight Committee using the investigation to ask for paperwork to understand increased prices for drugs recently has sort of has the pharmaceutical company engaging in this process. Now, beyond these sorts of engagements, when we start to reimagine, when you look at a world where race has come to be realized, what is the role of the pharmaceutical industry in the new normal?
It's a good question. I can tell you what we're doing next, which is to get to raise, we're starting this process of participatory change making. So next year, what we'll be doing is we're basically going to do a 360, the 360 leadership audit, where if you're having a review, everyone gets interviewed, from your boss to your partners to your collaborators. So we're going to do a 360 on the patent system, and we're going to look at it from the eyes of people who are actually, stewarding the status quo every day, patent examiners and judges, from those who benefit the most, which is, pharmaceutical companies, their investors, and I think very importantly, also from the perspective of those who are most affected by it, because those are the voices. Globally, there's extraordinary work that's been done in this regard. Today, civil society is actively engaged with their patent offices all over the world. There's organizations doing this work, but in the US, there's really just a lack of that. And so making sure that communities and organizations who are most affected by high drug prices have the opportunity to engage and to give voice to their concerns, and sort of doing this very holistic audit of, if we wanted to move race forward, what are the perspectives? What's that real world insight that we need to get to inform what comes next? And I think that'll be a good place.
That's fascinating. And on the idea of multiple voices, we have a really interesting question from Annette, who says, I would love to hear Priti's thoughts on this question. There are less people from certain demographics coming forward for the clinical trial phase with valid fears due to abuses in the medical sector, including some very well documented cases. And what are your thoughts on the implications of this?
Okay. I'm trying to figure out how to say this so my thoughts aren't hugely controversial. Okay, so I think what Annette is referring to is, in the United States, we see that there is structural racism basically baked into the entire medicine system. Systemic neglect, from what diseases are prioritized from research, which we're living in a system that is prioritizing profit, right? It's not prioritizing the public health in decision making. So from what diseases get research, to how our public research dollars are spent, to the patent system, to clinical trials, to, all the way down the chain to like what drugs are prescribed and what happens with health outcomes, the whole system. And there are people doing extraordinary work on that as well, who we will also lift up on Twitter after this. But what I'll say about it is this: clinical trials are one piece of this, and for me, it's the most complex. In the United States, Black and Brown communities have been subject to exploitation in the system of medical research since the beginning of the country's founding, right? And so we have so many examples of that. So there's huge levels of mistrust. There are people, including people from Black and Brown communities, who are working right now to rebuild that trust. And this is where I may be a little controversial, but you asked what I think. I think in the moment of COVID, where Black and Brown communities are disproportionately affected, disproportionately dying, I understand why there is a push to make sure that companies are included. And there has been, we saw this with multiple myeloma, we saw this with HIV, where Black people and Black women are just historically excluded. It's crazy if you look at the numbers of that structural exclusion. But there is a balance between rushing to enroll people in clinical trials and actually doing the real work to build trust. And that is not going to happen overnight. Here in Oakland, everybody that I'm in community with, there's still mistrust. People are not going to get that value, be knocking, standing mixing so many metaphors, you get the idea. They're not going to be rushing to be first in line. Everybody that I know, there are whole communities who do not want to be vaccinated, where that trust has been calcified over time. I'm also hearing from people, though, that they are open to having those conversations, but not in a way where it is driven by stakeholders who have money to gain from the ultimate outcome, right? So we have to be really thoughtful, I think. And this goes back to something I was talking to someone in India recently, Lena from MSF. She was reminding me that we made such huge strides in HIV because we used the rights-based approach to health, meaning we understood that by elevating community voices and protecting the human rights of communities, we would do the best job at curbing the spread of the global pandemic, which at the time was HIV. We've lost that here. Rights language has just gone out the door when it comes to COVID. There's not meaningful participation of affected communities at any level that we're seeing at the global level. And so what does it look like to center the rights-based framework, which I believe now, I'm dating myself right now. Now I think it's called health equity. Great. How are you making sure that communities are leading the process, are at the forefront of those discussions, and not to achieve your agenda, but for them to figure out what they really want and have the opportunity to lead that conversation?
Priti, thank you for that response and being so thoughtful. I know there is a deep historical context there. We are over time, and I'm delighted that people have been able to stick around for a few minutes more. We could just talk for a very long time. And just at the end there is you touched on a sentiment that I was going to ask you about to help wrap us up, is what gives you hope? What is starting to take shape that makes you hopeful for what we can do next?
I think it's what I said before, our movement has to have this combination of understanding very technical issues and proposing solutions. And we need those technical issues to be unpacked, demystified, to build the momentum, to build people's understanding of what change could look like. And I'm seeing that shift happening. We do need, I'll tell you what we need is we need more storytellers to join us, more journalists, more animators, designers, people who have the ability to take this medicine system and the very complex issues and help bring them to life for a larger public.
Right. Well, that is an invitation and a call to action to everyone who is listening and asking, what can I do to support this work, and what can I do to be a change maker? And I think, Priti, I've heard from you, we've heard from you the echoes of everyone stepping into their roles of taking ownership for what's in their community and how they can reimagine what healthcare looks like for themselves. And you've talked about building a movement where people are leading this effort to shape the healthcare systems, which is the echoes of Ashoka's deep core philosophy of everyone a change maker. And so it's been deeply inspiring to hear you say that. We are well over time. So if there are more questions, please do put them in the chat, and we'll see if we can share them with Priti and who might respond over email, or you've got her Twitter information. Follow IMAC on Twitter, and I can promise you she's very present in conversation on social media platforms. Priti, thank you so much for making time. I know time is extra precious these days for everybody. So thank you all for joining, listening, participating, and sharing your questions and comments. This is truly a generational opportunity for us to shape a world that we can truly be proud of and we can all thrive. And we are thankful for the support of all of you that allows us to sort of find and support people like Priti, who are doing such incredible and powerful work that we are proud to call Ashoka Fellows. So thank you, everyone, and stay tuned for our next conversation. Thanks again, Priti.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.